the quiet, forgotten woods of a small American town, an urban legend has taken on a life of its own. Jeff the Killer is a name whispered in fear, a story of a boy twisted by madness, now a haunting presence that preys on those who dare to seek him out. What begins as a late-night adventure for three friends, John, Steve, and Rachel, quickly spirals into a terrifying ordeal as they find themselves caught in the grip of something far more sinister than they ever imagined. This is not just another tale of survival. It's a chilling descent into the unknown, where the line between reality and nightmare becomes increasingly blurred. Join us as we unravel the dark mystery behind one of the internet's most infamous creepypastas and discover the horrifying truth that awaits those who delve too deep into the legend. Prepare to face your fears and question everything you thought you knew about the monsters that lurk in the shadows.
The night we decided to head out into the woods behind Steve's house was meant to be nothing more than a fun, adrenaline-filled adventure, a way to relive the carefree days of our youth. Steve, Rachel, and I, John, had been friends for what felt like forever, and though life had pulled us in different directions, the bond we shared was strong enough to bring us together for this one night. Steve had always been the thrill-seeker, and Rachel the rational voice of reason, but tonight, none of us could deny the allure of chasing a ghost story. Steve had been the one to bring up Jeff the Killer. It was a name that resonated with all of us, like a half-remembered nightmare. We'd heard the tale as kids, the one about the boy who had been driven to madness, his face twisted into a permanent, grotesque smile, who now haunted those unlucky enough to cross his path. It was a story that had grown legs, one that spread through the internet like wildfire, warping and twisting with each retelling. "Come on, it'll be fun," Steve had said with that reckless grin of his, packing the trunk of his car with flashlights, snacks, and a couple of baseball bats. Just in case. It's just a story, but the woods at night, that's where the magic happens. Rachel had hesitated, her eyes flicking between Steve and me, searching for some sign that this was a bad idea. But the spark of curiosity and nostalgia was too strong, and she relented with a sigh, pulling on her jacket as she mumbled something about regretting this later. As the car bumped along the dirt road, the shadows grew longer, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels watching our approach. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a cool breeze whispering through the branches like a warning we chose to ignore. Steve was still grinning, but there was a tightness to his expression that hadn't been there before, a slight tremor in his voice as he joked about not running into the smiling maniac. The clearing we eventually found was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making the hairs on your neck stand on end. We piled out of the car, each of us gripping our flashlights a little tighter than necessary, trying to laugh off the tension that seemed to radiate from the darkness around us. "So, what now?" Rachel asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, sharp and uncertain. "Now," Steve replied, his grin wavering, "we see if we can find Jeff." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air, but before we could question it, Steve was already heading towards the tree line, flashlight beams slicing through the blackness. Rachel and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between us before we followed him, our footsteps crunching on the underbrush, sounding far too loud in the oppressive quiet. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the light from our flashlights, leaving only small circles of dim illumination on the ground before us. The trees closed in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound that made my stomach churn. It was Rachel who stopped first, her hand shooting out to grab my arm, nails digging into my skin. "Did you hear that?" I strained to listen, the silence now buzzing with a kind of electric tension that made my skin crawl. There it was again, a soft, almost inaudible rustling, like something dragging through the leaves. Steve's flashlight swung wildly as he turned towards us, his face pale in the weak light. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He took a step forward, the beam of his flashlight catching on something just at the edge of the light. Or maybe not. Rachel and I stepped closer, our breath catching in our throats as we saw it. A thin, almost imperceptible trail of something dark smeared across the ground, leading deeper into the forest. Steve knelt, his hand hovering over the trail, not quite touching it, his face twisted in a grimace. "I think we should head back," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." But Steve was already standing, shaking his head as if to clear it. "No, we've come this far. Let's just see where it leads." Reluctantly, we followed, our footsteps slow and hesitant as we continued deeper into the woods. The trail seemed to twist and wind between the trees, always just ahead of us, as though it was leading us somewhere specific. The first real jolt of fear came when the trail abruptly ended at the base of a large, gnarled tree. Steve turned to face us, confusion and unease battling in his eyes. Before any of us could speak, there was a sudden, sharp crack, a branch snapping underfoot. We froze, the sound echoing through the stillness, too loud, too deliberate. In that split second, we realized we weren't alone. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, and caught a glimpse of movement, something pale, fleeting, disappearing behind the trees. The flashlight beam swung wildly, but it was gone, leaving only the oppressive darkness and a sense of creeping dread. "We need to leave. Now." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper, her face drained of all color. But Steve, stubborn as always, shook his head, his jaw set in determination. "No, we." The words died in his throat as the sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling us. My pulse raced, fear clawing at the edges of my sanity as we huddled together, backs to each other, flashlights darting in every direction, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped, the silence descending again like a heavy blanket, suffocating. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then we heard it, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from all around us, a voice that sent chills down my spine. "Go to sleep." The words slithered through the darkness, wrapping around us like a noose. Rachel let out a strangled gasp, her flashlight shaking violently in her hand. Steve's grip tightened on the baseball bat he'd brought, knuckles white, eyes wide with terror. We broke into a run, the panic driving us forward, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were headed as long as it was away from that voice. The forest seemed to close in around us, branches snagging our clothes, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath our feet. Somehow, through the terror and the chaos, we managed to make it back to the car. Steve fumbled with the keys, cursing under his breath as he tried to unlock the doors with shaking hands. Finally, the locks clicked open, and we threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut, the feeling of safety only marginally returning as we sped away from the woods, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. The drive back to Steve's house was a blur, none of us speaking, the tension in the car thick and oppressive. When we finally pulled into the driveway, we sat in silence, the events of the night replaying in our minds, too surreal to fully comprehend. "Maybe it was just our imaginations," Rachel whispered, though her voice was hollow, the words sounding like a desperate attempt to convince herself. Steve shook his head, his expression haunted. "That was no imagination." For weeks, the memory of that night lingered like a shadow over us. We tried to go about our lives as usual, but the tension between us grew, unspoken and heavy. Steve became more withdrawn, spending hours locked in his room, researching the legend of Jeff the Killer, searching for some kind of explanation, something that would make sense of what we'd experienced. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, the phone rang. It was Steve. His voice was frantic, almost unrecognizable, a far cry from the confident, thrill-seeking friend I'd known. "John, I found something. You need to come over now." When I arrived at Steve's place, Rachel was already there, sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. Steve was pacing the room, his eyes wide with a kind of manic energy. Papers were scattered across the coffee table, printouts from the internet, old newspaper clippings, all detailing the story of Jeff the Killer. "I've been looking into this," Steve said, his voice tight. "There's something off about the story. It's not just a creepypasta, John. I think there's something real behind it." Rachel and I exchanged a worried glance. "What do you mean, real?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There have been sightings, John, all over the country. People have seen him, and they've disappeared. I found a pattern, places he's been, people who've vanished after seeing him. It's like he's hunting them." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Steve, you're scaring yourself. It's just a story." "Is it?" Steve shot back, his voice rising. "Then why did we hear that voice? Why did we see whatever that was in the woods?" I had no answer, the memory of that night still fresh and terrifying. But before I could respond, there was a loud, insistent knock on the door. The three of us froze, the sound echoing through the quiet apartment. Steve's face drained of color as he stared at the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the baseball bat he'd left by the couch. Rachel shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't open it, Steve." But Steve was already moving towards the door, the bat clutched tightly in his hand. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stop him, to get out of there, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Steve opened the door, and for a moment, everything was still. And then, with a sudden violent force, the door slammed shut, cutting off our view of him. We heard a struggle, muffled and desperate, and then, silence. "Steve!" Rachel screamed, rushing towards the door, but I grabbed her, pulling her back, my own terror mirrored in her eyes. For a moment, we stood there, too afraid to move, to even breathe. And then, slowly, the door creaked open. Steve stood in the doorway, his expression blank, the baseball bat hanging loosely at his side. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and unnatural, as though he was being controlled by something else. "Steve!" Rachel's voice was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. He didn't respond, just kept walking towards us, his eyes empty, lifeless. And then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "Go to sleep." I felt a cold, creeping dread wash over me as I realized what was happening. The legend wasn't just a story. It was real, and it had found us. We fled that night, leaving everything behind, driving until we were far from Steve's house, far from the woods, from the nightmare that had taken hold of our lives. But no matter how far we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that something had followed us, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't until a few days later that I received the text from Rachel. Her message was short, frantic, and it made my blood run cold. "John, I saw him. In the mirror. Steve's gone. I don't know what to do." I tried to call her, but there was no answer. I drove to her apartment, but when I arrived, it was empty, the door left ajar, the place ransacked as if someone had left in a hurry, or been taken. I stood in her empty apartment, the silence oppressive, and for the first time, I felt truly alone, a deep, suffocating loneliness that threatened to swallow me whole. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We had been hunted, and now I was the last one left. Days passed, then weeks, and I found myself jumping at shadows, unable to sleep, my mind replaying the events over and over, searching for something I could have done differently, some way I could have saved them. But it was no use. The legend was real. Jeff the Killer was real, and he was coming for me. I tried to stay vigilant, tried to prepare myself for the inevitable, but deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. The signs were all there, the fleeting shadows in the corners of my vision, the faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to echo in my mind when I was alone. I was being watched, stalked by a ghostly figure that existed only in the darkest corners of the internet and in the twisted nightmares of those who had encountered him. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the room illuminated only by the flickering glow of the TV, I heard it, a soft, almost gentle knock on the door. My heart stopped, every muscle in my body tensing as I stared at the door, knowing what waited on the other side. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and I knew I couldn't avoid it. My hand trembled as I reached for the baseball bat I'd kept by my side, my only defense against the inevitable. But as I approached the door, something stopped me. A feeling, a memory that surfaced from the depths of my mind. Steve, Rachel, the nights we had spent together as friends, the bond we had shared. And then, something else. A moment, something I had forgotten, something that had been buried beneath layers of fear and paranoia. The night we had gone into the woods, the sound of footsteps, the voice that had whispered to us. It hadn't been coming from the darkness. It had been coming from Steve. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me like a sledgehammer. The legend wasn't real. Steve had been playing us all along, manipulating us, using our fears against us. The disappearances, the sightings, it had all been him, twisted and consumed by his obsession with the story. He had become the legend, driven by a madness that had taken root deep within him. But now he was gone, taken by the very darkness he had sought to control. I stared at the door, the baseball bat slipping from my grasp as the truth settled over me like a shroud. The knock came again, soft, patient, as if waiting for me to open the door and face the monster I had once called my friend. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't face him, couldn't face the truth of what had happened to us. I turned away, backing slowly into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, I realized I had never left that night in the woods. The memories, the events that had unfolded since then, they were all part of the same nightmare, a twisted, inescapable loop that kept repeating over and over. The final knock echoed through the room, loud and final, and I knew that when I turned around, I would see him, Steve, standing in the doorway, his face twisted into that grotesque, all-too-familiar smile. But when I did, I saw only darkness, stretching out before me like an endless void, and I knew, with a sinking, horrifying certainty, that I would never escape. I was trapped, caught in the web of my own mind, doomed to relive the same nightmare over and over, until there was nothing left but the darkness, and the soft, insistent whisper that would follow me into eternity. Go to sleep.
Have you ever found yourself questioning what's real and what's merely a product of fear? The darkness holds many secrets, and some legends are more than just fiction. They're a glimpse into the unknown. If you've ever faced the unexplained or been haunted by something that shouldn't exist, share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Until next time, stay vigilant and trust your instincts, because sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we can't see. If you'd like to hear another story, we've selected this video about the mysteries of Hollow Creek, which is now appearing on your screen. And remember to subscribe.